The early 2000s was filled with new promotions, big and small, popping up looking to either capitalize on the wrestling boom or fill the void left by ECW and WCW's closure. We've covered a few already, but one promotion had something that the others didn't: a legend, a former world champion, and a booker with a very successful track record. All being, of course, one man: the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. This is Defunct Championship Wrestling, Episode 27, the story of Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling. In late 1999, as WCW struggled to maintain its success from 2 years prior, changes needed to be made. Firstly, in October of 1999, they brought in the writing duo of Ed Ferrara and Vince Russo from the WWF to oversee the creative for the company. A month later, WCW Executive Vice President Bill Bush fired the legend Dusty Rhodes. Rhodes allegedly had lobbied for the head of creative job before Russo and Ferrara were officially named to the position. It was a job that once upon a time had been his. A couple of times, actually. Dusty was also reportedly not pleased with the creative direction of his son Dustin at the time. Presumably to avoid any further conflict, Bush decided just to get rid of the American Dream. Because it was Dusty Rhodes, of course independent promotions came calling. However, Dusty's asking price was a little too high for them. Rhodes was already struggling financially even before being fired from WCW. And the lack of work coming his way only made things worse. That's when an old protege came calling. In December 1999, Paul Heyman approached Dusty about coming to work for ECW. Heyman had learned a lot from the Dream in his teen years, and learned even more once he was in the business working for Dusty and Jim Crocker Promotions and WCW. When Dusty first started talking to Heyman, he assumed it'd be the same conversation he'd had several times already with other promoters. Paul's pitch was different, however. He was ready to give Rhodes a great money deal as a flat fee for any appearances. So Dusty would get paid the same whether he came in just for a promo, a run-in, or a match. The Dream's ECW run would primarily see him feud with Steve Corino, the perfect opponent for him in my opinion. In fact, Dusty has referred to their matches as legendary shit. The ECW deal was great and it gave Dusty some peace of mind, but it wasn't full-time or very consistent. The American Dream needed a steady income, so in 2000 he started up Turnbuckle Entertainment, under which he opened a wrestling school. A while later in 2000, after realizing how few promotions there were running aside from the big three, Dusty decided to start his own independent promotion, Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling. The tagline for the company being old school with modern ideas. TCW wouldn't be Dusty's first time in the ownership role, as he once co-owned the Pro Wrestling Federation in Florida with Steve Keirn and Mike Graham in the late 80s. Difference being, PWF was mostly taking over the Championship Wrestling from Florida spot, whereas TCW was being built by Dusty from the ground up completely. TCW would be based in Georgia, running VFWs, farm centers, and civic centers in towns like Calhoun, Thomaston, Woodstock, and Carrollton. In fact, the Carrollton VFW was eyed as a potential venue to film TV in the future. Dusty had planned almost from the beginning to eventually do TV similar to the old TBS studio show. The roster featured former WCW stars and I assume Georgia locals like Scotty Riggs, Barry Windham, and Glacier, as well as regulars from the independent scene like Malia Hosaka, Steve the Brawler Lawler, Luther Biggs, and Sean Shocker Evans. Of course, Dusty would work the shows as the main draw and bring in other legends like Leilani Kai and his former tag partner Manny Fernandez.
Raging Bull, Manny Fernandez, Dusty's tag partner, you know, the guy you supposedly is your mentor.
And obviously the cards featured Turnbuckle students like Kim Nielsen and the late Scotty Beach. In the summer of 2000, Glacier would become the inaugural TCW heavyweight champion. Glacier would have multiple reigns with the belt, as would Barry Windham and Scotty Riggs later in the promotion's run. In Dusty's book, he mentions that in its first year, the promotion was pretty successful. They were drawing about 300 fans every show. And a lot of those fans were diehard, never missing a show. and Dusty made sure that that dedication was rewarded by making talents, including himself, available for autographs and pictures after shows. And that success would carry into 2001, which, as you can assume, would bring a lot of changes. In early 2001, TCW would introduce tag team titles, with Eric Watts and Scotty Riggs being crowned the first champions. Later teams that would hold the belts included Jorge Estrada and Glacier, The Public Enemy, Southside Trash, Big Daddy and Randy Harris, Glacier and Ron Reese, the Yeti, and Jorge Estrada and Sonny Siaki. The promotion would also expand their territory into places like DeLand and Live Oak, Florida, and Dothan, Alabama. In March, Dusty would make a brief return to WCW and team with his son Dustin against Ric Flair and Jeff Jarrett. April 2001 would bring a huge shift in the national wrestling scene. In case you've lived under a rock for the past 20 plus years, ECW closed the month prior, and WCW had been purchased by the WWF. This abrupt change in the landscape left a lot of wrestlers looking for their next payday, and hopefully a spot back on TV. When ECW started to really go down the drain in early 2001, Dusty started booking some of their talents like Tajiri, Super Crazy, and of course Steve Corino. And when they shut down for good, he brought in more ECW stars, like C.W. Anderson, New Jack, and Tommy Dreamer, who Rhodes seemed to have a lot of respect for. That same month, Dusty announced that TCW would be running a pay-per-view in the fall, featuring former WCW names. He also announced that they'd be airing TV very soon. Starting in June 2001, when TCW ran their next set of shows, we'd get some of those former WCW stars, including Lodi, Disco Inferno, Larry Zbyszko, Daphne, Canyon, and most surprisingly, Scott Hall. It really shouldn't be that big of a surprise, as it seems Dusty was always a big Scott Hall supporter. In August 2001, Dustin Rhodes joins the company. In the wake of WCW's closure and Dustin's divorce, he and his father started to rebuild their relationship, and working together on TCW was a huge step forward for them. Dustin really believed in the promotion, and what they were and could be compared to the WWF, saying in an interview at the time, "TCW is the alternative to the World Wrestling Federation. To me, in my mind, my opinion, and my dad's opinion, we are the World Wrestling Federation's competition. We are not an independent. We are a company. We want to be treated as one. So we're going to do everything we can to make it a respectable, family entertainment business." And TCW truly was a family business by this point, as Cody Rhodes spent his junior year in high school refereeing some matches for Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling, and was also a part of the ring crew. By the fall of 2001, that rumored pay-per-view would never come to fruition. However, TCW did have airtime locally in Macon, Georgia, and had talks with Channel 5 in Atlanta about a time slot. There was also some negotiations with the Sunshine Network. According to Dusty, however, they wanted a lot of money to air the show, and they just bounced back and forth and could never come to an agreement. In 2002, Dusty was clearly aware of the difficulty that XWF was having selling their show, so he opted not to shoot for the moon and try to build the TV clearances slowly. But I don't know how concerned he actually was with landing a major TV deal, saying in an interview at the time, "You're going to see television become not as important for promoting your talent as the web, and the websites and computers and all that knowledge will be in the next 5 years. You're going to see that come into play more than how many syndications you have or how many syndicated cities your show goes on." They may not have scored a big-time TV deal or a pay-per-view, but they did release some shows on VHS through RF Video. Also in the fall, TCW would introduce a short-lived hardcore championship, with the only two champions being Jason Sugarman and Lodi. In 2002, the wrestling scene would again undergo some big changes with the launches of Ring of Honor in February and NWA TNA in June, both trying to fill the same ECW-WCW void that TCW was. Early 2002 would also see a somewhat major departure when Dustin Rhodes returned to the WWE as Goldust in that year's Royal Rumble. 6 days later, Dustin would lose the TCW Championship to Scotty Riggs. He'd have a couple more matches for TCW in February, before starting back full-time, defeating fake Goldust and Steve Corino on his way out. Also February of that year, TCW started running weekly shows at the Carrollton VFW. According to TCW ring announcer Virginia Holbrook, the move to weekly shows was done to prepare to eventually be able to tape TV there, saying, "We want to start filming TV. This is where our TV venue, we want it to be. So we've been doing a little testing on that, doing video cassettes and selling those. So this is where we really want to be able to shoot TV. This is where we want to make our home base. We want to call this TCW Arena. Allegedly, at some point in the year, because of TCW's success, Vince McMahon and the WWE came calling for Dusty to join the creative team. As the story goes, Dusty turned them down because he wouldn't have full control, since everything would filter through Vince. This offer, however, would come as Turnbuckle's business was on the downturn. Crowds weren't growing and were actually shrinking in some markets. As Dusty writes in his book, while the people I had surrounding it and actually working for me worked very hard, we just all didn't do anything right. If I had to do it over again, I would, but you can't go back. I can't really put my finger on what exactly Dusty may be referring to that they didn't do right. Maybe the roster didn't have enough star power, maybe he didn't feel they did enough on home video, or they ran the wrong towns. He didn't really go into detail. But reviewers from the time criticized the match quality and length. So to many, the matches were long and bad. Maybe it was that. Larry Goodman from One Wrestling once summarized a show from September 2002 writing, "Old school doesn't adequately describe this show. Except for the hardcore match, this was slow school. Not a single dive to the outside, and the finish of the main event was the only top rope move on the whole show that connected." Looking back at some of the cards though, they don't seem to be just dull match after dull match. There were TLC matches, bull rope matches, bunkhouse matches, and various street fights. Also, they ran angles like Barry Windham turning on the Rhodes, which I think was really well done even without following the build-up. Unfortunately, there's not much footage that surfaced online. As things with TCW started to decline, Dusty decided to take advice from an old friend. At that point, I said to myself, I'm gonna have to go out and hustle some like Terry Funk told me. And hustle was exactly what he did. Throughout 2002, he increased his indie bookings to include places like MLW, 3PW, and many others. In 2003, TCW continues to drive forward and even grows a little further north, running shows in Cleveland, Tennessee. They also welcome new talents to the roster like Jim Duggan, Chase Stevens, James Storm, Ray Gordy, and David Flair. Also in 2003, Dusty joins TNA as an on-screen character and eventually would become the booker. Jim Duggan, Kim Nielsen, and David Flair all come into TNA shortly after Dusty showed up. Coincidence? Yeah, definitely, but it is interesting. TCW would run a handful of shows in early 2003 before ceasing tours in May. In the summer of 2003, Dusty's website would tease upcoming dates in Georgia, Florida, and Oklahoma, but those events, as far as I can find, never happened. They also teased that long-awaited studio show, but that also wouldn't happen. Turnbuckle Entertainment would continue on running wrestling seminars and camps, as well as hosting charity fundraisers, like this Dusty Karaoke contest. 2 decades would pass, and in December of 2023, the Nightmare Factory, the wrestling school run by QT Marshall, Cody, and Dusty Rhodes, filed to trademark Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling. In February 2024, Cody's sister Teal would relaunch TCW as a way to raise funds for the Dusty Rhodes Foundation, while also giving the factory students a place to work. The shows featured Nightmare Factory students, AEW talents, independent standouts, and TCW alumni like Glacier and Scotty Riggs. The relaunched TCW ran shows every few months until April of 2025, when it was folded into One Fall Wrestling, which I believe is also run by QT Marshall. And 1FW has shows coming up, so check them out if you're in the area. And that's the story of Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling. Once TNA and ROH started up, it was pretty much the end for TCW. They never really took off to be on anyone's radar outside of the Southeast. TNA had bigger names, better financial backing, and decent TV distribution. ROH had young, exciting stars and such high match quality that word spread quickly about it. And those were places fans wanted to watch and wrestlers wanted to work, including Dusty. TCW, however briefly, served its purpose. It gave Dusty a source of income, a way to contribute to the business, and gave a small audience an alternative to WWE. Even though the audience was small, TCW did have loyal fans that came out to every show. It just wasn't enough fans. And Turnbuckle seemed like a really special place for the talents that work there. Many wrestlers like Lodi and Daphne have commented about how fun working for TCW was, and how important it was for them personally. So well done, Dream. Let me know your thoughts about TCW in the comments. You can also leave recommendations for future DCW episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by subscribing or finding me on social media, either here or here. I'm Scott from WrestleSpective. Watch wrestling, love wrestling. Thanks for watching.